Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's very nice to see you all tonight. And a special welcome to those of you who are watching on STOW TV, whenever that is aired. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library. And I wanted to let you know a few things before we get started. First, we have a program coming up Thursday this week with Joe Bagley, who is the city archaeologist for Boston. And Joe will be talking about his new book, which is called Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. You can register using the link in the chat. We think that this is going to be an interesting and educational program. Tonight, we are delighted to have David Mark with us again, speaking as part of the Sesquicentennial History Series. The next talk in the series, The Rise and Fall of Digital Equipment Corporation, will be on June 14th. And that registration is also in the chat. And just a matter of business, we'll have a Q&A session after the talk. And David has asked that you type your questions in the chat and then I'll read them out to him. And if you are not familiar with where the chat is, you can find it in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Okay, let's get started. Since 2009, David Mark has been a contributor to the Beacon Villager with his column Life Outdoors. The column covers a broad range of topics, including local history, outdoor recreation, and natural history, from Babe Ruth to local business to family histories. Collections of these columns form his two books, Maynard, History and Life Outdoors, and Hidden History of Maynard. David is also a member of the Sesquicentennial Steering Committee. So welcome, David. It's lovely to have you. And let me do the spotlight. All right.
All right, so Sally, thank you very much. And thanks to the library for this opportunity to again share some of what I think is very interesting about Maynard, which is this case, the Assabet River that runs through the center of it. So I'm going to be going through a series of slides. I'm talking as I go. We'll then have time for question and answer. If you're willing to stick around, there's a couple of bonus slides I'll show after the end of it. So let's see if we can get to bringing up the show. Sharing the screen. Okay, can people see this?
We can see your screen.
Okay, and Sally, just to confirm, are you getting pictures of slides down the left side or just the slide itself?
The index is also on the left side, yeah.
All right, there, how about this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so again, just the marker, here we are, Monday, May 24th, and this talk is about the Assabet River floods and droughts, and so much of the information was sourced from the Maynard Historical Society and the Maynard Public Library. I'm just very happy to be able to share it. If we think about where we are, we get summer moisture coming across, let's say, lower New York State, Connecticut, a lot more coming up from the Atlantic, and then we get our classic nor'easter storms because they're sort of cranking up the coast, vigorously turning clockwise as we go. So we get these strong winds out of the northeast, and a lot of moisture, depending where they are, and the temperature dumps tremendous amounts of snow where we are. What this all means is that when we get this surface water, it moves down into the soil and moves through the soil to help form the streams. And it also runs surface runoff, runs to these streams. So you get these two sources of water, and occasionally you even see a spring or a vernal pond that is fed almost solely by the percolation. And then the water also leaves us. It evaporates directly up. It's also taken up when the trees are active and the plants are active. It's taken up in these trees, and transpiration, these plants release the water directly to the atmosphere. So the important point there is a lot more of the water moves through the plants back to the air when the plants are green. And it's very different in the late fall and winter and spring when the plants aren't actively, basically, discharging water in that way. You may have seen this before, and you'll see it more than once in this talk. This is not quite oriented north and south, more left to right, but what we've got here is a 34-mile-long river, which starts in Westboro and runs through a number of towns. The watershed's actually touching some 20 towns and then connecting in Concord to the Sudbury River to form the Concord River. And I do want to back up for a moment, and something I meant to say as part of introduction. I want to say this land constitutes the watershed of the Assabet, Sudbury, and Concord rivers, is part of the ancestral and traditional home of the Nipmuc people. Let us take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land and these waters. And you think about what's in a name. In eastern Pennsylvania, there was a creek called the Wallenpawpack Creek. And you have to say, okay, this has to be an Indian name, and it is, because the indigenous Lenape people named it Wallenpawpack, which meant and means the stream of the swift and slow water. And the same can be thought of when we think about the Assabet, because it's a relatively short, relatively steep river. So when it rains, it gets very zippy very fast. And in drought, it slows down and becomes quite low very fast. So it can go from basically lackadaisical to flood in 48 hours. And of course, our name is Assabet. We know it's a Nipmuc name. We're not exactly sure of the derivations, so we just have to take it as the traditional name of the river. We see here we're comparing the Sudbury River and the Assabet River, both of which turn out start in Westboro, and both start out fairly steep. But the Assabet River continues to be steep pretty much over its entire length. Well, the Sudbury River is steeper beginning, and then once it gets down to the Saxonville Dam and past that, it just goes flat. It's dropping only about a foot per every 2 or 3 miles. So it has basically almost no visible flow. It's a very sluggish river. So when the Assabet, and it also has a very, very wide floodplain. So when the Assabet River floods, it gets fast. When the same amount of water ends up in the Sudbury River, it gets wide. And so the two rivers have just a very different nature when the rain falls. And in fact, sometimes the Assabet River develops and discharges its flood so fast, the Concord River, that by the time it gets to the Concord River, the Sudbury River hasn't even begun to rise yet. And the water from the Assabet starts reversing the flow of the Sudbury, and the Sudbury is at this point moving in the opposite direction entirely, flowing what should be upstream because so much water is coming out of the Assabet, and it's going in both directions, into the Concord and into the Sudbury. So the Sudbury becomes briefly and interestingly a two-way river. We're going to be talking about cubic feet per second. So I just wanted to make sure you have a general concept. A cubic foot of water is 7.5 gallons. Cubic foot per second, therefore 60 per minute, 3,600 per hour, 86,400 per day. When we think of the Assabet at its lowest, it's about 10 cubic feet per second. So that's still delivering about 6.5 million gallons per day. It's a lot of water, because you have to realize Maynard draws from its wells less than 1 million gallons per day from its wells. The annual average for the Assabet, and we'll see more about this later, is 200 cubic feet per second. So what flows through Maynard over the course of the year is equivalent to 130 million gallons per day. Again, a lot of water. All communities in the Assabet River watershed are using about 10 million gallons per day, either from wells or occasionally from surface water ponds and reservoirs. That surface water includes Nagog Pond, which is inactive but it supplies water to Concord, Gates Pond for Hudson, and the Milham Reservoir for Marlborough. They're all in our watershed. This is the Ben Smith Dam at pretty much dead low water. At this point, I am standing in the middle of the river on a rock. I was able to walk out there without getting my shoes wet. And you can see there's barely a trickle coming over the top of the dam. Now, an interesting point here is that the mill pond is topped up with water from what's backed up behind the Ben Smith Dam. However, the owners of the mill pond are prohibited from diverting water into the mill pond if the flow in the river is less than 39 cubic feet per second. Why 39? I have no idea. But the point is the mill pond itself can start dropping down in prolonged drought because the mill owner is not allowed to top it up. But if they get a thunderstorm and suddenly there's a lot of water coming over the dam, they can quickly open up the gate next to High Street and let the water into the pond. This is a more typical flow. So you see there's a fair bit of water, and those orange floats on the cable are to prevent boaters from getting too close to the dam itself. Now, if you notice this nice crooked tree in the middle, growing out of the shoreline, looking very happy. And if we look at what happened in 2010 in the flood, this is the same tree on the far left. You can see it's underwater about 6 feet deep, and that is an awful lot of water coming over the top of the dam. And by awful lot, I mean this is 2,500 cubic feet per second of water coming through the center of Maynard. And you have to think, if you're standing there on the Main Street Bridge, it's only about 50 foot wide, that's 115 yards of water, 15 cubic miles of watershed, all pouring water down towards you on that bridge. This graph, which was used in my first book, sort of portrays the average height of the river by month against precipitation. The important point here is precipitation, as marked by those raindrops and snowflakes across the top, pretty much averages 4 inches per month. There isn't really a dry season or a wet season. We average in this area continuous waterfall, rainfall, snowfall that averages out to about that amount. And yet the blue line, the swoop, sort of shows that once you hit February, March, April, you're getting to about 400 cubic feet per second, and then rapidly dropping off to like July, August, September, averaging about 50 cubic feet per second. But anytime it stops raining for a couple of weeks, it can drop down to 20 or so. So again, the river can vary a lot, and it's going to sound different. It's going to look different. I don't know if any of you are aware, but there are occasions that people in kayaks and canoes will put in just below the dam and travel through the center of Maynard, crossing under each of the bridges. This is only possible when A, there's enough water to float their boat, and B, there's not so much water that they're going to be headbanging on the bottoms of the bridges. So there's this nice little gap in there where it's possible to canoe right through the center of town. Moving along, again, the average over, we have 100 years of data, in this case, 80 years of data shown in this chart, is 200 cubic feet per second. But you can see there are years that are wetter and years that are drier. So if I circle this here, the early 60s was a tremendous drought. The worst was 64, 65, 66, when the average dropped tremendously. There's some very wet years up here. And then we hit a sharp drought in 2012. And then not shown here, there's another sharp drought in 2016, 17. Now, if you look at this, you say, okay, the red line is flat, but there seems to be maybe a hint of a increase over time. So if we actually plot out the slope, it says yes, for some reason, or apparently, or obviously, there's more water on average over time flowing in the Assabet. So the question is, why is that so? Because we haven't made the watershed bigger. We haven't stopped taking water out of the river. It's the same river, and yet you can see over a long period of time, the average goes up. So now we get this beautiful chart that shows average temperature over time. Your red line is the change over time. The left scale here shows that back around 1900, our average temperature for Massachusetts was just a touch over 47 degrees. And we hit 2010, and we're just a bit over 48. So we've gone up just a bit more than 1 degree Fahrenheit. Doesn't seem like much. However, if we look at precipitation, we go back here, we're averaging, again, I'm going to follow our red line, 35 to 40 inches per year. And by the time we get up to now, we are averaging closer to 50 inches. We have become a much wetter state, which suggests that we're more flood prone than we were before. And if you remember, we go back 2 slides, more water on the river is obviously more rain, more water on the river. As to why this is so, you have to understand that warmer water, and I'm going to simplify this, warmer air holds more moisture. So when warmer air coming across the ocean, which is warmer, coming across the land, which is warmer, and hits a cold front, you get a lot more rain coming out of it because the air that is being precipitated out of was holding more water to begin with. So again, we've got a drought here, another spikes of drought, but the general trend so far has been more. To show you what we mean, these are two shots from 2010. So this is March 2010. On the right, you can see this is from the footbridge of the rail trail. You look at there and the water is just about 1 foot under the Main Street Bridge. That's March. August, same year. We're now looking at, a dry summer. Everything turns green, and yet the water has dropped down to this very low level. So this just gives you a sense of how different things can be when you're going from flood to drought. This is an interesting picture from 1927, which was one of the worst floods on record. It's basically from the Main Street Bridge looking the other direction towards what was that point was the railroad bridge, very elevated. And then there was a low bridge underneath, which is pretty much the equivalent of where the footbridge is. And this is the parking lot behind what is now John's Cleaners. At that point, it was a business that sold coal, and the water is actually filling that. And here, sort of splashing back into it. So that parking lot is underwater. On the other side, the Gruber Brothers parking lot would have been underwater. Water had been getting into the Gruber Brothers building. This is about as high as on record as we have floods. And this is 1927. It got pretty close to this in 1955, and we'll see a bit of a list. At the other end of town, famously, the Assabet River rose up. Now this is the Waltham Street Bridge. If we want to picture it, on this side, on the left side is McDonald's restaurant. On the right side, you have the 7-Eleven, Dunkin' Donuts. This is the Waltham Bridge, and the next day the water is already receding, but you can see it had severely damaged the bridge in 1927, and the bridge was replaced in 1928, and again just replaced recently, well not that recently, in 2013. They can't all be 100-year floods. 100-year floods means in any given year, there's a 1% chance that it'll flood that severely. But the point is you have to change your metric over time because, again, if precipitation is chronically changing, you have to redefine what's a 100-year flood and a 100-year floodplain, or what's a 10-year flood or a 50-year flood. So this term comes up, but it needs updating. I think Massachusetts is recalculating what are flood zones in these various towns. So we know if we look at historic floods, the records say serious flood 1850, 1900. The one in 27 was damaged the Waltham Street Bridge. 36 in March, so again, a wet spring, worse since 1850. 38, this is a hurricane zipping through. We don't know the amount, but we know there's tremendous amount of damage. In 1942, they installed the automated gauge, which is just upriver of the Waltham Street Bridge. So suddenly now we have exact footage to the 10th of a 100th of an inch. So we say that Hurricane Diane reached 8.94 feet. And in 1968, again, spring rains reached 8.15 feet. An interesting point there is that flood was high enough to put water into the mill, which is that point mostly rented out by Digital Equipment Corporation. They had bought it in 74, but they had rented most of it by 68. So the people from Digital were in emergency sandbagging along the river to try to keep the water out. And Ken Olson, the founder and president of Digital, was down there in his suit and tie and shirt, but in boots, helping fill the sandbags and getting the pumps ready to keep the water out of the mill. Afterwards, Digital built the wall higher on its side only, so that when the same level of water was reached 11 years later, Digital stayed dry, but it definitely flooded on the other side of Walnut Street and Main Street. Shortly after that, there's a number of flood control dams, and we'll get into what those are about. So you see the last significant floods we had, 1987, 7.14, and the one we're talking about, which actually hit a couple of peaks, 2010, hit 7.1 feet. Didn't get out, didn't get into buildings, didn't cause damage, was just a lot of water zipping through town. Let's call it harmlessly. Now, if you're observant and if you're walking down Main Street, and this is John's Cleaners, you can see there are foot markers painted on the wall of John's Cleaners. These are not official. This is the depth of water at that spot, so it doesn't match up what is officially measured, but it does give you sort of an easy sense of just how much water is in the river. And in this case, it was really quite low because it was well under the 2-foot mark, and I think somewhat Optimistically, we've got an 8 and a 9 up there, but it's possible it may never get that high again. Okay, we're back to comparing Assabet and Sudbury rivers. And again, the Assabet is steep. The Sudbury is relatively shallow. The flood for Assabet is defined anything more than 5 feet. And you can see these, each dot is a year. And you can see that the Assabet, again, gets steeper faster. And there's a couple of years where you got up to, 3,500 cubic feet per second of water. And you were above 8 feet. Actually, there's one off the scale here that would have been higher at 9 feet. And the Sudbury defines flood as 10 feet, but it just is a shallower river, a wider river. If you saw it in 2010 from the upper floors of Emerson Hospital, you could call it the Sudbury Ocean because you could just not see the other side of the expanse of water that was there behind the hospital. This shows a year of water from the record. So here is our 2010 flood. You might say, sure, got saturated a couple of weeks, beginning of March, and then really hit the middle and end of March, and then just declined until by August. We're down at, just barely more than 10 cubic feet of water. This is a log scale, so that's 10, that's 100, that's 1,000. It's not a linear scale. There's our definition of where flood starts, but it just gives you a sense of what you can get from this gauge and the sort of information you get and what happens. So each of these spikes basically is, a rainstorm. Sometimes quite a bit of a rainstorm, and then it runs out, and rainstorm. It's just very dynamic. If you plot each flood day by day, what you see is, if you call the peak, I had 20 days of data, so sent the peak there in the middle, that pretty much from when the rain started to when the river hit its peak here was 2 days. Again, short, fast river. It's not as if you're going to hear half a state away that, oh, the water's coming. The storms tend to impact the entire watershed, each storm. And therefore all the water shows up at once, and all of it shows up, and you end up with these floods and then these declines like that. Now, as far as controlling floods, so here we are again. The red dams are the traditional dams that were built on the river as mill power. So we've got, it's called Aluminum City because it's next to a building called Aluminum City. We have no idea what they did there. Allen Street Dam, Hudson Dam was mostly leather goods and powering mills. Gleasondale was shoes. Ben Smith Dam was obviously powering for the woolen mill. The Powder Mill Dam was gunpowder. The Damon Mill Dam was, again, wool. The other things you'll see on this are Tyler, Nichols, and Damon Mill. These are flood control dams. They're built there to basically slow down the water, to hold back the water in times of flood. So you've got the Nichols, the Tyler, and Damon Mill was a historic dam, but the center is breached, but it's narrow enough. It still also acts basically as a flood control dam. If you're looking at this, you also see a couple of black stars. This is where these towns discharge their cleaned up wastewater into the Assabet River. So you've got 1, 2, 3 upstream of Maynard. Maynard dumps its wastewater on the Acton border. So you've got each of these dumping their wastewater back into the river, which we'll touch on when we talk about drought. All right, before we pass this, I want to say there are actually 3 different methods of flood control. One is obviously dams. Now, before people had dams, you had beaver dams. Beavers basically provide a lot of flood control because their dams dam up all these tributaries. They hold back water, and then after the storms are over, the water trickles through the dam. They're not tightly watertight, so it sort of slows it down, but still provides water. So it keeps the river from going bone dry, and it slows down the flood. So we've mimicked them with our various flood control dams. Another possibility is you build levees or walls. So you start piling up dirt on your side of the river, and it's the other side that floods, and the people who live on that side of the river start piling up dirt on their side, and then the piles get higher and higher, and then the town downstream gets flooded, so they start building a levee, and then the people upstream get flooded, and they start building a levee. And one of the points there is when you start doing this, the river keeps on bringing sediment down, and it keeps on depositing it in the bottom of the river. So while you're building these levees, the bottom of the river is gradually moving up, and the river is getting shallower, and then you have to start building your levee. And what you end up with is the Mississippi River down by New Orleans, where the river level is much higher than the surrounding towns. And when you need a levee break, it floods these communities because the river basically has been moved up compared to the surrounding land. The third choice is for steep rivers such as the Assabet, is you basically wall it and make it into a channel. When you do this, you make the water move faster. What you've done is you've moved the problem from your town to the next town down the river. I think an extreme example, if any of you have ever been in Los Angeles, you got the Los Angeles River, which basically most of the year is this wide, hundreds-yard wide concrete channel with this little trickle down the middle. But when it rains, that becomes a raging river zipping down to the ocean very quickly. So again, it's a way to do something with flooded water, but you have to realize what you're doing is you're moving it somewhere else. It's still going to rain. I mentioned the flood control on the Assabet, but in addition, all these tributaries, all these streams and brooks also have flood control. Now, some of you may have up into Delaney in the recreational area. And so we look at all these, there's a lot of flood control. I've added these purple lines to show where they are in these tributaries. So we've added a lot. And what we're going to say is the holdback of the big ones, 500 million gallons, 1,800 million gallons, even Lake Boone. Lake Boone is, the water leaves to the Assabet, but it takes a while for it to get over the top of the earthen dam that created Lake Boone. So that's a holdback. And the holdback, the total capacity of holdback is about 5 billion gallons of water. So this is now a controlled river. It's kind of hard to see those big floods before. Okay, let me take a moment here to wet my whistle. And we're going to talk about drought, which is never as exciting as flood, but it's worth considering. Massachusetts created a drought management plan in 2001. So the state's roles here are to monitor, communicate, guide, and then if it has to enact emergency powers. You have to remember the range again is 30 to 60 inches per year. Remember those charts, 3 to 5 inches per month. In 2010, we got 15 inches of rain in March. That's what a very wet March can look like, but this is the average. Data dates back to the late 1800s. However, the driest 5-year period on record and all of that was 62 to 66. The most recent level 3, and these are the levels I get into, was the summer 2016. An important point to realize here is that up until the 1960s, Maynard got all of its drinking water and basically all of its tap water, all of its water from White Pond, which is on the Stowe-Hudson border, and didn't have any wells. But when the drought kicked in the early 60s, Maynard realized that White Pond was not going to necessarily survive this drought, and it's going to be necessary to start creating wells. So Maynard started adding wells in the 60s in the middle of this drought, and then by the 90s, abandoned White Pond and was on 100% on wells, but is still considering the idea as resurrecting White Pond because it owns water rights to White Pond to start that up again. Now, to do that, of course, you need miles of pipe. And the latest estimate is it cost about $30 million to revive our White Pond water. So at the moment, we're dependent on wells. The wells have enough of a reserve, but there's always a concern that if we tap down into our aquifer and get a little bit too ambitious about how much water we take out, or maybe its population increases too much, we may surpass the ability of the aquifer to replenish itself on a yearly basis, and may need to consider going back to White Pond to adding that as a water supply. Droughts, level 1, 2, 3, 4. So what used to be called advisory, watch, and warning, it went to numbers. And you have to say, what does this mean? Okay. Maynard right now is at level 1. Maynard is at level 1 every year. Regardless of how the aquifer is looking, how the drought conditions are, Maynard just always goes to level 1, just as a way of keeping us aware. So from May 1st, basically May through September, Maynard is at level 1. This means no outdoor watering between the hours of 9 and 5. Why those hours? Well, when you're watering during the middle of the day, a lot of that water ends up just being evaporated into the air. You sort of waste a lot of it. If you're watering early, it's more likely to seek, or watering late, it's more likely to seek out into the soil and benefit the plants you're trying to water. So again, early and late watering minimizes water loss to evaporation. The ban is specific to sprinklers and irrigation systems. handheld waterings allows, you can stand out there with your hose, you can water the nice plants that you planted, you can water the stuff you have in pots or window boxes. You can wash your car. However, if we get to level 3 and we sort of jump, you see, you jump from level 1 and that's it, go to level 3. All outdoor water use is prohibited. So the last time we had level 3 here was in the summer of 2016. Right now, again, we are at level 1. It's been a dry year. I don't know if you had that sense, but over the last 12 months, we are about 8 inches below or 20% below average. And if this continues, we're going to be probably moving quickly into a level 3. You know, it used to be a warning for this area. One question comes up: can we remove the dams? How would that affect floods? Well, at one point, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers developed or created an Assabet River sediment management plan. What they proposed was that before removing the dams, you'd have to dredge 250,000 cubic yards of sediment behind all the dams that is built up over 100 years, which would take 4 to 5 years. Sediment averages 2 to 4 thick, in some areas more than 70 feet thick. All of this will be trucked away, because otherwise, as you remove the dams, each flood would move sediment downstream, making the river very shallow and flooding everything downstream. So you can't just remove the dams and say it'll all behave on its own. And also you'd lose a lot of flood control capacity, because even the dams that are on the Assabet with water flowing at the top do slow water down. So in effect, this would probably increase flood risk by removing the dams on the Assabet. At the moment, there's no plan to do this. It was, as we said, an assessment in 2015. Okay, at this point, I'm going to step out of the slideshow and we're going to take some questions. So let's do, how do we do this?
So we don't have any questions yet. So anybody who has a question, please type it in the chat.
Surely I haven't answered every single person's question. So if there's anything.
I've got a question, if you can hear me.
I can.
That last slide talked about if you wanted to remove a dam, you would have to have a lot of the sediment trucked away. Where is away?
Probably the same place our garbage goes to. No, away is always a very good question. One of the points is, if it's not too contaminated, it could be going to sanitary landfill sites, which currently accept garbage because sanitary sites cover the garbage with soil almost on a daily basis. So there's a need for basically soil which could be dredged, drained sediment for these existing landfill sites, which could be quarries, valleys, hauled off to Michigan, up to New Hampshire. Away is always a good question.
David, there's a question from Kathy. What was the reasoning for wanting to remove the Ben Smith Dam a few years ago?
And I realized it wasn't to remove it. Is it just what they did was to control how much it was letting through?
Well, let me say something. I'm not sure this is the answer, but
Okay.
you have to realize there's the dam, and then there's a canal that runs parallel to High Street, and there's a gatehouse on the canal. And the gatehouse is used to control how much water goes in the mill pond. Now, that was traditionally used to power a turbine that made electricity, but that hasn't been in use since 1983. There is still this gatehouse which controls how much water goes into the mill pond. About 2 years ago, the mill pond was mysteriously raising in level, even though there was no desire on the part of the mill to let water in the mill pond, and it had to discharge water from the other side, and they didn't know what was going on. And I finally, having seen this a couple of weeks, contacted me, and I said, "You've got a problem with your gatehouse." He said, "What do you mean?" And I had taken video and showed
the water is flowing past the gatehouse. They said, no, it's closed. I said, here, look at the video. The water is flowing through the gatehouse. And they hired divers to go down and find out that there was basically a log that had gotten loose and got stuck under the gate. So they had to remove that. And then, well, lo and behold, the gate worked again. But I'm not sure that I'm answering your question about.
Yeah, no. It was, oh geez, probably 5 years ago. And there was a lot of discussion in town because they were wanting to do something with the dam and it was going to let less water into the mill pond. And I think they backed off of that because the mill pond still has water in it.
Well, here's the point. If you take away the dam, there's no water from the mill pond. The only reason the mill pond exists is because the dam raises the water high enough. So one of the repercussions of removing the Ben Smith Dam is mill pond becomes just a big mud pit in the middle of town.
Yeah.
So if you want to keep the mill pond, you need to keep the dam.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, there's a question from Jane. Can you explain the Louisiana water incident with regard to New Orleans being built below water level? What is the impact of flooding with regard to the levees?
New Orleans was not built below water level. New Orleans was built next to a river. And over time, because of the levees, the river is now higher than the city. So it's not as if let's build this place, that's next to a river. It is again, it's an accident of understanding that you've got tremendous amount of sediment coming down thousands of miles of river, and you're building these levees and you're making them taller. And what you've done is you've created the problem where the water is now higher than the city. So I don't know if you've ever been there, you're sitting there, Jacksonville Square, and you want to see the river, you have to walk up quite a bit of hill, the levee, and when you get up there, the water's up there. You go, oh, it's higher than the city. It's unresolvable, I think is the answer I have to say.
Thank you, Mark.
There's a question from George. Was the Delaney Project put in because of the flood in the 50s?
Yeah, the Delaney Project, I think, was 78. There was some money available. So all of these, the Nichols, the Tyler, and the Delaney were all put in pretty much because of, the 1955 flood causing millions of dollars of damage, and an attempt to say, okay, the next time a hurricane comes through, that's going to happen again. So all of those were sort of built in that period, 60s, 70s, as a preventive against, it's the severe flooding, mostly hurricane type water.
There's a question from Pamela. Are there projections for the continuing effects of climate change on flooding?
Guess the short answer has to be yes. There are places that are going to be wetter. There are places that are going to be drier. There are going to be places that are going to change over from having annual average rainfall to having wet seasons and dry seasons. There are places out west that get by on 10 inches of rain a year that are going to be in trouble if it drops to 8. So a lot of it is place by place. For example, here, winters have gotten shorter, but because there's more moisture in the air, the amount of snow in a shorter winter has gotten higher. Now, that can't go on forever. You can't have all of your snow in February. But for the moment, what we're seeing is more and more snow each year over a shorter period of time. But at some point that breaks, and then we're down to rain, winter rain, ice storms, and we don't get the snow anymore. So there's a break point there where something's going to change radically.
Okay, there's a question from Cindy. You mentioned that it would cost approximately $30 million to connect back to White Pond. Is the 129 Parker Street development moving us in the direction of needing to do so?
Yes and no. And I say that because it wouldn't have been built if it wasn't clear that Maynard already had enough of reserve water supply to provide the water for the increased population. People use more water than businesses, and less businesses are in a very water intensive situation. So most of what you see at 129 Parker are businesses. You do have a couple of hundred apartments there. people and they're using water, they're taking showers, they're doing things. But again, it wouldn't have been built without knowing that our existing water supply was not sufficient with a reserve. The issue is, of course, always what happens if a well breaks, you know, which has happened. So you always want to be forward looking and look beyond what the current situation is. With the current situation now, Maynard is currently at its highest population ever. I think the data from the census, the 2020 census, will show that Maynard now has a population in excess of 11,000 people, which is I think 7 or 8% higher than it was 10 years ago. But Maynard doesn't become 20,000 people. It doesn't become 15,000 people. It doesn't have the buildable land to add that many more people. So I think we're still within 120 and Parker. We're still within our water reserves.
Okay, there's one from Vivian, who's asking, are there projects to use plantings on the riverbanks to mitigate some of the damage of floods?
So can you read the question again?
Are there projects to use plantings on the riverbanks to mitigate some of the damage of floods?
No. Okay, so the point is, when you see tremendous amounts of development and you turn a field into a parking lot, you've turned all that rain that would have soaked into the soil into stormwater runoff. So the more development you get, the more you risk moving a lot of water to the river fast and therefore flooding. This really can't be compensated by doing a little bit of planting along the riverbanks. You have to control it by not building these massive malls and parking lots. Now, of course, that's just what happened at 129 Parker. So you have to say, how much storm water does that create? And we know where it's going to go. It's going to end up in the Assabet. So you have to forward look towards whatever you're building. And it would be nice if people plant more trees on their property. It would be nice if there's more plant, but planting things along the riverbank is too small an area, too small an effort to have an impact on flooding, on water runoff.
Okay, a question from Steve. Wouldn't use of an uncovered water source such as White Pond require, under current laws, more purification because of goose and other droppings in the pond?
Well, this was the reason why Maynard stopped using White Pond, and I think it was in 1990, as the state water requirements had become more strict, and it would have required a increased water processing before water was turned over into the town reservoir. So the answer is yes, it does cost more to process surface water than well water. Here's an interesting point. When Maynard first built its water system in 1888, and it built a reservoir on top of Summer Hill to pump the water up into, so that water coming out of that Summer Hill reservoir from its water pressure and height powers water throughout the entire town. That reservoir had no top. It was just basically open to the sky. So it was just a moved pond. You took water from White Pond, you put water in the reservoir. Yeah, there's still birds crabbing it, leaves falling and insects dying in it, and you cleaned it up as best you could, meeting the standards at the time. It has a top now. The other tank up there has a top, and any water coming from White Pond would need to be cleaned up to meet standards, current standards, before we'd be drinking it again.
Okay, there's a question.
The 30 million includes processing, not just the pipe.
A question from Marion. Is it economical to generate electricity from the Assabet?
No. The point is, to generate electricity requires volume and vertical drop. And you have to realize that the mill switched over from water wheels to a turbine and did generate electricity using that turbine till about the 1950s when it shut down. And then digital actually resurrected it in 1968, I think, used it to power electricity. But all you get out of the water there, you only got about 15-foot drop and 100 cubic feet per second going through that mill pond, is about 125 kilowatts. So it's just too expensive to resurrect that turbine and go back to generate electricity at that site, because there's not enough volume and there's not enough vertical drop. Yeah, I think you're just doing better if you start finding more places in town and put in solar panels.
There's a question from Bill about the quality of the sediment in Mill Pond. Are you aware of any times the pond has been extremely low to provide an opportunity to clean up dumped dumped bikes, tires, etc.?
Some of you may have seen pictures, but in 1918, the mill pond was entirely drained so that building 3 could be constructed and the pilings put in to put. So if you're standing there, basically in the farmer's market parking lot, and you're looking at the building, you realize the building is over the water. All that had to be constructed by draining the pond. And you see pictures of people walking across the bottom of the pond to get over to a St. Bridget's church, or just walking around through there, or there's enough water that people would ice skate there. It has been. And then in the 70s, I think it was dropped, not that far, but maybe five feet or so to do some maintenance at the gates and such. Yes, there's stuff in the bottom of the pond. There's bottles and cans and broken glass, and maybe there's bicycles, but you're not allowed to swim in there. No one's drinking the water. You're not allowed to ice skate on the pond when it freezes. So I think just what's in the pond stays in the pond.
Okay, I have one last question here. Anyone else? If not, we'll go to Jean's question, which is, sorry, I lost it. What's the most surprising thing you learned during your research?
Well, actually, it was something I saw which showed just how much the attitude of the river changed. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization, was the organization of the Assabet River, which expanded out of the organization of the Assabet, Sudbury, and Concord rivers, has been doing annual cleanups for so long, but you can find a picture of the 70s where it's clear that it was traditional for some reason, Maynard, to drive across the Walnut Street Bridge, maybe in the middle of the night, stop there and throw your old car tires into the river. And there are pictures under the Walnut Street Bridge of literally hundreds of tires, a reef, basically a sandbar worth of tires under the Walnut Street Bridge, which have since been carted out one at a time by hand. And then the Elks Lodge parking lot seemed to be the one other spot that people want to throw tires in. So when that area was, the water was dropped there, what's called Ripple Pond, to repair that dam, again, oars came in and removed literally hundreds of tires out of that section of the river. So the nice thing is tires aren't going to the river anymore. What I think most amazes and makes me happy is people have changed. People have stopped thinking the river is a place where stuff is just going to go away. It has been very bad in the past. The Sudbury River, at the head of the Sudbury River for some 80 years, there was a plant that was in the manufacture of chemical dyes. And its overflow was in a small stream into the Sudbury that was called Chemical Creek for a reason, because tons of mercury and arsenic and other chemicals ended up being washed into the Sudbury. Literally 10, 20 tons of mercury ended up in the Sudbury and Concord rivers. You cannot safely eat a fish out of those rivers. And that seemed to be an attitude that was a long time changing. So the fact that the river is so clean now that it's hard to figure out where to send volunteers to take stuff out of the river because nothing else is going in the river anymore is a miracle, for which I'm very happy.
You hear seniors in town talking about watching the river run green or blue or whatever the mill was dying that day. So, sometimes brown, sometimes purple. So yeah, that's a good change.
Yeah, I just say brown was interesting because you have to realize the wool came to the mill, was referred to as in the raw, which means on wash. So the first thing you had to start doing was using huge pots the size of large hot tubs of boiling water to wash the dirt and urine and feces out of the wool before you could begin to process it. And all of that went to places that a lot of that ended up in the river. So upstream, kids played in the river, but no one played in the river downstream of this mill. And yes, the dyes, once you're done dyeing and you were rinsing the dye colors, if you dig down in the muck down there, you're going to hit layers of blue and green or whatever color they were dyeing, because that's ended up in the sediment.
And related, there's a question, why does the river water appear brown now? Is
Actually,
that just...
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, is that sediment or is it tannins or?
Actually, the river is remarkably clear. I mean, you can stand on the bridge and you can see fish and you can see bottom. Occasionally, there's algae and duckweed growth on the top because the river still has a fairly high phosphorus and nitrogen, which is another whole situation I'm not going into. But the water itself, you have to remember, Ben Smith Dam backs up water almost 5 miles. All the sediment that comes into the river above the Ben Smith Dam parks there. So it's pretty much clean water, clear water coming over the top of the dam. This is not a muddy, except in times of severe local runoff where you're seeing local surface runoff. But there's not a lot of soluble tannins in the river. And most of the time it's just very clear water. It's a nice clear water column. People do swim in it. It's not officially swimmable, but people swim in it.
That's all the questions that I have here.
All right. If people want to hang around, I do have a few bonus slides. So let's see if I can get back to that. Okay. All right. I am going to have to figure out. All right. We're in slideshow. So first, can you see the slideshow?
We can.
And I'm not sure if I remember how to get rid of the, all right.
So we're still seeing the sidebar, but I think that's fine.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to bang through these real quickly to get to the one. Let's do this. Okay, we are here. Okay, so the one on the left, this is the Aluminum City Dam. It's the furthest dam upstream. No one even remembers what it actually was built for, but it's still there. The next one is the Allen Street Dam. In the background, that's an aqueduct that carries the water, and this is the Allen Street Dam. Here you've got the Hudson Street Dam, which is, you can see from this bridge in the Hudson Street Dam. This is the Gleasondale Dam. It's not visible from the road, but if you trespass a little bit, here's the water going over the dam, and this would have been the channel that would take the water to power through the mill at Gleasondale. This was the paper mill dam that existed in the middle of Maynard to power a paper mill, which is actually older than the woolen mill. So again, this is from standing on Waltham Street. To the right, on this side is where McDonald's is. To the left, out of the scene, is where the 7-Eleven is. And you can see it was just sort of staggered. It was referred to as the Falls. This washed out in the flood of 1927. It stopped being used in 82, but it washed out in 27. Here you have the Powder Mill Dam. So again, this is a sort of staggered coming down, and by powder mill, this was where gunpowder mill was manufactured for over 100 years, and there were explosions fairly frequently. People blown up. I think at one point the owner was blown up. Workers had to go around the next day finding body parts and cleaning up. But this is the same dam you see in flood with a tremendous amount of water coming over the Powder Mill Dam. Okay, we're now at the Nichols flood control, which is basically this earthen dike. This is the crib that allows the water to go from this pond, which is permanently here, used for fishing and boating. And this channels the water. So when it gets high enough, it overflows the dike down to this far end, but otherwise it's a channel. This is the Tyler flood control dam. So it's this huge structure. Water only comes out through this little gap in the center. So this is, again, a water holdback area that holds back over 1 billion gallons. Here we have the Delaney flood control dam, a very long earthen dike. You'll see here in the distance this crib structure, which allows water to flow underneath out the other side. So this is, again, sort of a passive or somewhat controllable way of keeping water from flooding downstream. And I think we've got one more slide. Now, if you remember, there was those numbers on the wall of John's cleaners to show the depth. This is me standing in the river a couple of years ago with this nice stencil I made and a ladder and painting those markers on the wall. So you can see them down here by the 2 and the 3 and the 4 and the 5, and up at the ladder I get the 9. So I just felt that would be nice that if we had some way of just walking across the river and saying to yourself, how deep is the water? To get permission to do this, I had to A, clear it with the Conservation Commission, B, clear it with the Department of Public Works, C, get the approval of the select board. D, get the approval of John's cleaner, so the building of the building, because this was actually their wall. The only group I didn't have to talk to was the state of Massachusetts, because the state of Massachusetts owns the water, but since I wasn't permanently impacting the water, I didn't have to bother with them. It did have to tell the police that on a certain day, a large man was going to be in the river below the Main Street Bridge and had no ill intentions towards that bridge. So all in all, it was a bit of approvals, and we now have those markers on the bridge. I'll show you where they. So we can get up here. Oh, we lose them. Ah, there they are. So listen, I'm going to leave you with that. We're going to stop the share of that. It's been fun. I've enjoyed this. I hope you have too. And before I sign off, I want to say that the Sesquicentennial Committee has published a book about the history of Maynard, which is for sale at Six Bridges Gallery, Wednesday through Saturday, 12 to 5. There are some 5,000 households in Maynard. So far, we've only sold 300 books. So if you know anyone who needs a book as a present, if you need it for your own reading, you know someone graduating high school, someone who's nostalgic for Maynard because they moved away, I suggest you buy them the new history book and make that person a happy person. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.